Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into a pretty significant projected shift here in Britain.
You mean the Paul Mann projection
Yeah,
about white British people potentially becoming a minority around 2050?
exactly that. And well, as some listeners might know from my own writing, like The Strange Death of Europe, this is a really sensitive topic.
It absolutely is. It touches on identity, the future. Really deep stuff. And, if you're listening and feel a bit uneasy about that idea, that's understandable. It's a huge potential change, regardless of how you feel about it personally.
Right, and that's what this deep dive is about, really. We want to explore the facts, the different angles, the perspectives presented in the source material we looked at with Douglas Murray recently, not about saying if it's good or bad right now.
So understanding the landscape.
Precisely. And one of the first things Murray pointed out was how the whole conversation around this in the UK has, well, it's evolved, hasn't it?
Yeah, he described that shift from people basically denying it was happening at all.
To then sort of saying, okay, maybe it is happening, and actually, it's a good thing.
And now almost a kind of resignation.
Yeah.
Like, well, it is happening, so what are you going to do about it? That kind of feeling.
That progression itself says a lot, doesn't it? This sort of slow dawning, maybe, combined with a feeling that it's just inevitable.
Well, yeah. And does that sense of inevitability then become part of the reason it happens? It makes you wonder.
It really does. Murray used this interesting thought experiment. He asked, how would another country react?
Oh, the Pakistan example.
Yeah. What if Pakistan, over, say, a century, went from being majority non-white to majority white?
He suggested, quite strongly, I thought, that Pakistanis would be pretty alarmed. They'd be asking a lot of questions. Why? How?
It forces you to think, doesn't it? Why might the reaction, or the public discussion at least, seem different here in Britain compared to how it might play out elsewhere?
It's a useful comparison. Is there something culturally specific about the British response, perhaps? Or the lack of a louder response?
Yeah, could be. And it ties into this question of agency. Is this demographic shift, just like the weather, something you can't influence?
Murray argued against that, didn't he? He said government policy could theoretically shape things.
But then he pointed out what he sees as a lack of political will. Like the political class doesn't really want to touch it.
There's often that tension, isn't there? Long-term societal shifts versus the short-term focus of, well, politics. You need sustained thinking for something this fundamental.
And instead you get this sort of it's happened attitude from some politicians. Murray mentioned Boris Johnson's comments about London becoming majority non-white years ago.
Right, and Sajid Javid's reaction to the census data, that very blunt, so what?
Now, maybe that's meant to sound pragmatic, but it can easily sound dismissive, can it? Like brushing off people's concerns.
Yeah, it risks making people feel like their worries aren't legitimate or aren't being heard by those in charge.
Definitely. And these aren't just numbers on a page. Murray argued they're already impacting British politics day to day.
How so?
He talked about MPs across all parties being concerned about issues like Kashmir or Israel-Palestine for a long time now.
Ah, because of diaspora communities here.
Directly. He framed it as importing the world's issues along with the world's people. MPs feel pressure on foreign policy votes related to those regions.
That makes sense. International issues become domestic political footballs because of the communities living here now.
And it gets even more concrete. Remember that leaked Ministry of Defense report he mentioned from about 10 years back?
Vaguely, what was the key point?
It apparently said that British military action in places like India or Pakistan could be limited.
Because of the potential reaction from communities within Britain.
Exactly. Domestic political considerations tied directly to demographics potentially constraining foreign policy. That's quite something.
Wow. That really highlights a potential vulnerability, doesn't it? A nation's options on the world stage possibly being shaped by its internal makeup.
And then you have real-world examples like the Leicester riots in 2021.
Over the cricket match between Indian and Pakistani communities.
Yeah. Murray used that as a stark example of importing conflicts. These aren't abstract fears. Sometimes they spill onto the streets.
A really troubling reminder of how global tensions can play out locally in diverse societies.
Mm-hmm.
And managing that is, well, it's a challenge.
Which brings us, maybe inevitably, to this idea, this phrase, the Great Replacement.
Ah, yes. René Camus, Murray discussed him.
Right. And it's important context, isn't it? That Camus wasn't originally some, far-right figure. He was on the French left initially.
Wrote a book called Tricks that intellectuals apparently admired. His whole Great Replacement idea initially was more about an observed, cultural and demographic shift he saw happening in France.
Based on what he actually saw, not just stats, he said he saw with his own eyes that the population had changed, particularly in rural France.
That focus on lived experience, on observation, is maybe why it resonated with some people. It wasn't just abstract numbers.
Then in 2010, he gave that speech, actually titled The Great Replacement.
And now, if you search for it online,
Murray pointed out you mostly get results framing it purely as a conspiracy theory. Google prioritizes that interpretation.
which shows how powerful framing is online, right? The original context can get completely buried under the later, often more extreme interpretations.
And interestingly, Murray said Camus' work, including that speech, has only fairly recently been translated into English.
So for ages, people in the English-speaking world were debating the idea without easy access to the original source.
Which is never ideal, is it? Leads to
Well,
misunderstandings.
definitely. You need to engage with the source itself if you can.
And the reaction from the British government, banning Camus from entering the UK.
Murray saw that as pretty typical of how the British establishment reacts to these kinds of views. He compared it to banning Geert Wilders years ago.
It raises big questions about free speech, doesn't it? Where do you draw the line on barring someone for their opinions, even if they're controversial?
Especially when you contrast it with who is allowed in or allowed to stay.
That was Murray's point. He highlighted this perceived inconsistency. People who allegedly preach ethnic or religious conflict within the UK might be tolerated.
While someone like Camus, who's basically articulating an observation about demographics, gets banned.
That apparent double standard can really fuel public frustration, make people question the principles behind these decisions.
Absolutely. It feeds cynicism.
Okay, moving on slightly. Another figure whose name looms large in this whole discussion, Enoch Powell.
Hugely influential, incredibly intellectual as Murray described him,
Yeah.
but obviously deeply controversial for his views on immigration.
Even people who vehemently disagreed with him acknowledged his power as an orator, didn't they? Diane Abbott was mentioned, I think.
Yes, Powell is just one of those figures who refuses to fade away. His rivers of blood speech still echoes decades later.
Murray even shared that memory of meeting him as a boy, finding him mesmerizing.
It's striking, isn't it? Think of other politicians from that era: Reginald Maudling, Barbara Castle, Ted Heath, Roy Jenkins.
Most people under a certain age wouldn't know who they were. But Powell, his name still instantly sparks recognition and often strong reactions.
Murray suggested that enduring relevance means Powell must have been onto something, tapped into some deep-seated anxieties or observations that still resonate.
Whether you agree with his conclusions or not.
Right. And he mentioned Roger Scruton's essay, too, reflecting on Powell's speech. Scruton placed it in a wider European context.
Saying Powell wasn't totally alone, that similar figures across Europe were raising similar alarms about mass immigration and its effects back then.
Exactly. It wasn't just a uniquely British phenomenon, this line of thought or concern.
So if these are the concerns, and figures like Powell and Camus articulated them in different ways, what about solutions or responses? Can these trends be changed?
Well, the discussion touched on that. Murray mentioned his own view, drastically reducing legal migration, ending chain migration.
Those are clear policy levers aimed at changing the trajectory. It assumes the trend isn't just inevitable.
Then there's the issue of illegal immigration and deportation. Murray referenced leaders like Salvini, Meloni in Italy, Trump in the U.S., who talked tough on that.
But he also flagged the huge practical challenges, didn't he? You need a home office that actually functions effectively. You need real political commitment.
And the cost. Housing illegal immigrants in hotels, that's a massive expense right now in the U.K.
It is. Interestingly, though, Murray noted Nigel Farage seems hesitant to go all in on endorsing mass deportations.
Then the idea shifted slightly towards deporting people who actively, hate the country they're in, preach against it.
That gets really complicated, though. How do you define hate? Where's the line with free speech? It's legally tricky.
Very. But Murray suggested using a leverage, like withholding foreign aid from countries that won't take back their own nationals who've committed crimes here.
He used Pakistan as an example regarding dual national rapists, linking aid to cooperation on deportations.
A more hard-nosed approach, using foreign policy tools for domestic ends.
And he mentioned the U.S. revoking visas for students supporting Hamas, another example of trying to address views deemed problematic.
Which brought the conversation squarely onto the views within the British Muslim population. A really complex area.
Hugely complex. And the first thing is, you can't generalize about such a diverse group. That's crucial.
But Murray did cite opinion polls suggesting,
No.
well, concerning levels of sympathy for Hamas among some British Muslims.
And significant support for making it illegal to show depictions of the Prophet Muhammad,
Yeah.
which obviously clashes with free speech principles here.
It creates a real tension, doesn't it,
Mm.
between upholding free expression and dealing with views that seem actively anti-Western or anti-liberal.
He contrasted the reaction to Muslim students protesting against Israel on campuses often seeming to get quite a lot of leeway.
With the banning of someone like Rene Camus, that perceived double standard again.
Yeah. It raises the question, how much should a society tolerate or even facilitate views that seem aimed at undermining its core values?
Murray put it quite strongly. Should societies encourage those who openly want to overthrow them? He also mentioned the importation of sectarian conflicts by some students.
And use that stark hypothetical. What if people came here and started calling for the lynching of Black Americans? Would we say that's just free speech?
It's designed to make you think about where the limits are, or should be, especially regarding expectations of people who choose to live in a society.
He came back to those stats, the percentage sympathizing with Hamas, the number apparently doubting the October 7th atrocities happened as reported.
Framing it not just as a foreign policy issue about Israel, but as a domestic social cohesion problem for Britain.
He mentioned Jordan banning the Muslim Brotherhood, suggesting Britain should maybe consider that.
And pointed to warnings supposedly given by Middle Eastern leaders to the UK, saying Britain underestimates the problem of radical Islam here.
Getting that perspective from leaders in the region who deal with these groups firsthand is interesting.
And that final analogy he used, quite provocative.
The one about people who deny the problem of radical Islam probably just don't have enough Muslim friends.
Yeah, because, he argued, Muslims themselves are often very aware of the problem within their own communities. It suggests lived experience reveals things that abstract debate misses.
It's a challenging thought. Okay, so the final big chunk of the discussion focused on the Israel-Hamas conflict and its wider meaning.
Which is obviously hugely relevant given the protests and debates happening right now.
Murray strongly pushed back on claims Gaza was a concentration camp. He cited population growth, living standards compared to neighbors, international aid, even things like shopping malls.
Basically arguing it was a deliberate misuse of language designed to demonize Israel by invoking Holocaust parallels, using facts to counter propaganda.
He also addressed the civilian casualties in Gaza, acknowledging them, of course, but arguing the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths was historically low for urban warfare.
And attributing that partly to Hamas's tactics, embedding fighters in civilian areas, booby traps, and emphasizing that Hamas started this round of conflict on October 7th.
Context is vital there. He also flatly rejected the genocide accusation against Israel.
Saying instead that genocide is what Hamas attempted against Israelis on October 7th.
And he used that powerful quote from Vasily Grossman.
Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. Applying it directly to the accusations against Israel. Suggesting projection, basically.
It's a striking thought. He also talked about the immediate aftermath of October 7th here in the UK, the celebrations by some, the protests against Israel.
And the symbolism. He noted the lack of British flags or anthems at anti-Israel protests compared to their presence at pro-Israel events.
Interpreting that as potentially showing where some protesters' primary allegiances lie, perhaps not fully with Britain.
And the flag burning in the U.S. at anti-Israel protests.
Murray read that message as, it's Israel first, but it's all of you the West next.
He clearly feels very strongly about this. So his commitment stems partly from seeing biased reporting firsthand over the years, the sheer scale of lies told about Israel.
Which links to his next point. Why the disproportionate focus on this conflict, compared to, say, Yemen, Syria, Sudan, where casualties have been vastly higher?
He argued it's because radical groups see Israel as the first domino. If they can destroy Israel, they believe they can then dismantle Western civilization itself. Israel is seen as maybe more vulnerable, the soft underbelly.
So the intense focus isn't just about Palestine. In this view, it's part of a much bigger ideological battle against the West.
That's the argument. And he suggested the roots of anti-Israel sentiment among some Muslims are complex theological rejection of Jewish sovereignty in the region, resentment of success, but also a desire to strike at the West's foundations.
The Judeo-Christian roots, referencing Athens and Jerusalem as the pillars of Western civilization.
Yes, it's a very civilizational framing of the conflict.
He also touched on skepticism towards Israel, sometimes found on the American right. Mentioned the whole Judeo-Christian concept, Israel's importance to America historically.
And pushed back against claims of widespread anti-Christian sentiment in Israel. talked about protection of holy sites, the complexities there, and pointed the finger at the Palestinian Authority regarding the situation for Christians in places like Bethlehem.
Trying to counter narratives from different angles. And he briefly mentioned the isolationist strand on the American right, too.
Contrasting a desire for American strength or dominance with a reluctance to actually be involved globally.
Which led, finally, to a quick word on neoconservatism.
He acknowledged being associated with it in the past, but clarified neocon isn't just the same as hawkish. Said his views have evolved.
But still believes in using Western military power judiciously when necessary, while admitting failures like state building haven't worked well.
Right. Arguing against a total American retreat from the world, basically saying the US and UK are still forces for good compared to the alternatives. Critiquing anti-Americanism from both left and right.
So, wrapping it all up, it's clear these projected demographic changes in Britain are, well, incredibly complex. Loads of sensitivities, massive potential implications.
Absolutely. From domestic politics, social cohesion, all the way to foreign policy, and maybe even bigger questions about the future of Western societies. The goal today was really just to unpack the perspectives raised in the source material.
And hopefully give you, the listener, a sense of how interconnected these seemingly separate issues might be. The shifts happening here at home, the conflicts playing out overseas, the broader challenges.
Yeah, we really encourage you to think about those connections, maybe dig into some of the sources yourself and form your own conclusions. It's not straightforward.
Definitely not. Critical thinking is key. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Hmm.
And maybe mull this over. What are those subtle threads linking demographic change here with global events and the challenges facing the West? What might those connections tell us about where things are heading? Something to ponder.